Good evening everyone. There's still some spare seats at the front and it's a packed audience, so can I ask that everyone squeezes up and fills in the spaces. Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name is Guy Newey. I'm Head of Environment and Energy here, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dieter Helm to our venue and to come and address us this evening. Keynes once said that most practical of men are usually enthralled to the ideas of some long-dead economist. Well, if you work in the energy business and you've had meetings around Westminster, you will know that plenty of politicians and policymakers are certainly enthralled to the ideas of an economist, but he's certainly not long dead. He's very much alive and scribbling away furiously in Oxford. Dieter has produced a kind of endless flurry of journal papers, newspaper articles, rapid rebuttals on government policy. I recommend his response to Ed Davies' Myths on Deck. It's a kind of classic of the genre. And an excellent collection of books as well. And this evening he's going to talk about his latest work. He's covered a wide range of topics, not just energy, but regulation and kind of wider utilities sector. I think it's worth mentioning, although it's not particularly relevant tonight, that he's also chair of the Natural Capital Committee, which I think is one of the most interesting areas of policy that the coalition are looking at, and I hope the momentum continues with that. His latest book, which he's going to talk about, I'm sure, tonight, as well as many other subjects, is a kind of romp through climate policy over the last 20 years or so, and it may not surprise you, a few suggestions on how it can be improved. Dieter's going to speak for around half an hour, maybe a bit longer, and then we'll open it up to questions, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time, and I'm sure we'll get into a wide range of subjects: energy bill, Kyoto, etc. For those of you who tweet, the hashtag is Carbon Crunch, and it would be remiss of me to not point out that there is a book stand at the back for those of you who want to read more. Dieter, thanks.
Well, thank you, Guy. The combination of romping and being nearly dead is quite a thing to live up to. Thank you very much for inviting me to the Policy Exchange this evening. It's not my first time here. I did a lot of work on infrastructure and infrastructure finance with the Policy Exchange, and I have the highest regard for what they do. So it's particularly good for me to be here this evening. I have a piece of paper here I'll come back to in a moment. It's just I want to remember what the 5 myths were that Mr. Davey thought about EMR and energy policy, but I'll explain that a bit later. It's quite a good time to reflect on where we are in energy policy, in climate policy, particularly here in the UK, but also generally. So what we now have on the table is an energy bill, we have a gas strategy, and we have the outcome of the deliberations of 17,000 people in Doha. And that provides us a moment to stand back and say, well, where have we got to? Where's this going? Does it stack up? Could we do things better? And when you reflect on the energy bill and you look at the gas strategy, it's worth reminding oneself how we got here. After 12 years of energy reviews and white papers, this is what we've come up with. And I'll come back to some of the issues about how good an answer this is. But it's always worth remembering when you're looking at the answers that politicians give to try to work out what the question is that they're trying to answer. And actually, after 12 years, most people have forgotten what the question is that we started on this long process of energy reviews to try to answer. And the question was very simple. In 2000, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution recommended that we reduce the production of greenhouse gases. They forgot to put the word production in, but it turns out to be very important, by about 60% by 2050. And because it was a Royal Commission, it required a governmental white paper in response. And as so often happens with things like commissions, politicians jump up and say, yes, I agree. And then they think, ooh, how am I going to explain how I'm going to achieve that particular outcome? And we have spent 12 years upping the ante as to what we were going to do and trying to work out how to answer those questions, and quite a lot of other questions which have been thrown in incidentally along the way. So the starting point is climate change and making our energy system address climate change issues. And since that's the starting point, in order to evaluate how good the answer is that we've been given in these documents, we ought to think whether they make any difference to climate change, how well we're doing on global warming. And my book is really about standing back and asking those questions, or rather explaining an answer, which is, how could the world spend so much political capital, so much money, so much goodwill, so much effort for 22 years and achieve approximately zero? And in the front of the book, and I ensued for this time of the evening charts and PowerPoint, but there is one graph which I draw your attention to. It shows the growth of emissions from 1990, the base year for the Kyoto Framework and everything that comes afterwards, to today. And back in 1990, we were adding about 1.5 to 2 parts per million per annum. Now we're adding nearly 3. There is no blip at all in that line from 1990 to 2012. And indeed, if I'd been deliberately trying to make my point, I would have conflated the axes a bit, and you'd see it actually tips up towards the end. You might think a world recession might make a difference. Actually, we've accelerated our emissions since that time. As I come back in a moment, in this context, Europe's main contribution at the moment is to engage in a headlong dash for coal. That is a fact which people ignore at their cost. So if you're like me and you think that climate change is a really serious problem, and I appreciate some people are sceptical about these things. I'm not a scientist. I've tried to read as much of the literature as I can. My starting point is to take what the consensus, dangerous word, of scientists suggests is going to happen if we continue to take our emissions past 400 and past 500 and past 600. We are almost at 400 already. There is no chance of 2 degrees warming if that is what 400, 450 means being an outcome. There's no chance of stopping at that level. Okay? Now, of course, it may turn out the models are different, the feedback mechanism and so on, but we all deal in uncertainty. So we have managed in 22 years to spend a great deal of money, a great deal of effort. Europe has made it a centrepiece of its policy to be world leaders in this territory. And the outcome is, in the true sense of the word, pathetic. It's sad and it's tragic. So I asked myself in the book, how did this come to pass? I then say, why didn't, particularly the European energy policies, but Britain has plenty of these, make any difference? How did Kyoto make so little contribution, or actually arguably make things worse? How do we get to this state? And then I asked the question, if you really wanted to deal with climate change, what would you do? So let me just take you a little tour through those 3 parts. What's really caused this to happen? Why haven't existing policies worked? And what should we do about it if we care? And I really think the if is conditional. It's not at all obvious that people are prepared to face up to what would have to be done if we seriously wanted to bring down emissions. Now, if we start with what's happened since 1990, this isn't quite true, but it's roughly true. Coal, 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 China, coal, 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 India, China, coal, coal, coal. We have gone from coal being 25% of world primary energy to 30%. And that's a percent of a growing number. We have an enormous expansion of coal burn around the world, but predominantly in China. And in addressing the questions going forward, this coal issue will become extremely important, but just one other bit in brackets. And when we decarbonise the world economy, we want to decarbonise an economy with 2 billion more people in it, all with their energy needs and their requirements. Now, the facile and trivial response to that observation is to say, well, it's all the Chinese fault. So unless we can make the Chinese do something about this, and we're not prepared to invade them or send battleships round to deal with this problem, it's hopeless us trying to do anything. It's all their fault. So, you know, that's where we are. This isn't right. The story of China and China's coal is a doubling of its economy every 10 years. Its economic model is based on export-orientated, energy-intensive industries. It could not possibly have grown in the way it grew without these very large export markets in places like the US and Europe, which together are still 50% of world GDP. We imported the stuff with the embedded coal and carbon from China, and China's just a shorthand for quite a lot of developing countries. I've little amount of time, so I'm making it a bit too simple. And if you think about that for a moment, if you think about all the embedded carbon in the goods and services coming out of China, it gives you a clue to how Europe could have ostensibly reduced its carbon production, but actually made no difference to climate change. I'll give you a little insight into that. In the UK, we reduced our carbon production, because that's what Kyoto targets are about how much carbon comes out of your factories and your buildings and so on, between 1990 and 2005 by 15%. This is stunning. This is a result which led politicians, particularly Mr. Blair, to portray that we had broken out of the link between energy demand growth, carbon emissions, and economic growth. It's utter nonsense. In the same period, we increased our carbon consumption by 19%. We simply imported the steel that we used to make in Lanvern from elsewhere. Again, I simplify, but the result of about 19% increase in carbon consumption from 1990 to 2005 for the British economy is pretty robust for about 4 or 5 other studies than my own. My own was the first one, and it's fairly crude. Now, how do we increase the consumption? It's just the counterparty of the exports from the developing countries. So there's Europe, signed up to Kyoto. It looks beautiful under Kyoto. Kyoto is designed for the European Union. Here we were, deindustrialising, the Berlin Wall had gone down, the Iron Curtain had gone down, the Berlin Wall had gone down, there was a lot of hot air around Europe, we're decarbonising, and therefore, almost axiomatically, we were going to reduce our production of carbon while increasing global consumption. The unpleasant reality of that is, if you think that your carbon responsibility is limited to the production of carbon in Britain or in Europe, then you're just kidding yourself. The only sense of measuring carbon responsibility is in the goods and services you consume and the carbon embedded in it. Carbon consumption, not carbon production, is the measure of your carbon footprint. And of course that's very unpleasant, because that says if we really wanted to reduce our carbon consumption, this is going to cost us a lot. This is non-trivial in its activities. So Europe could continue under Kyoto. Kyoto is a European treaty. In fact, the only people left in Kyoto are European Union members, plus 2 other countries now. Everybody else has left. Okay? They claim it's only 14% of world emissions. Production, yes. 86% of production of carbon is outside the EU and outside Kyoto. These things matter in the frame. So as long as we go on with our carbon consumption patterns, and as long as the world burns more and more coal, global warming is going to go on, up and up and up. to 3 parts per million. It's going to carry on that rate. It's going to go through 450, and 500 would be a big ask to stop at that level. Okay. Now, if we look at the particular policies that stack up against this, again, it's basically the European Union again. So back at the height of the euphoria, because it took a long time for the Europeans to realise that things had actually gone wrong, in 2007, 2008, Europe signed up to the 2020 package in 2020. Okay? Only the Europeans could think that everything adds up to 20. It's quite a remarkable idea that to address one of the greatest challenges we face in global terms, that you come up with a simplistic short-term policy where everything adds up to 20. That would be bad news. But it has really distorting impacts. So in Europe, what we have done is, because the target is 220, and because Mr. Blair didn't understand the difference between energy and electricity, effectively what Europe has been forced to do is to devote a large amount of consumers' monies, because that's ultimately all there is out there, resources, to a very small number of technologies which can be delivered in the time frame that's being discussed. It is no accident that billions are poured into onshore and particularly offshore wind and rooftop solar, some of the most expensive ways known to mankind to make some marginal impact on emissions, if any. I'll come back to that point in a moment. It's because of the short-term target. Nobody in their right mind would think that the right way to go about decarbonising production, if that's what you wanted to do, would be to put all your eggs into those baskets. Now, it's worse than that, because the renewables targets essentially are offset by an increase in coal burn within the EU ETS. It's a one-to-one offset. And secondly, because choosing the most expensive technologies first raises the price of energy, you speed the deindustrialisation process, and therefore you accelerate the increase in carbon consumption. You really couldn't make it up that you could achieve so little in such a focused policy. This wouldn't matter too much if the total metric of this was small, or if climate change wasn't serious. But climate change is extremely serious. And the way we got to this process here in the UK, but also now in some other European countries, is because, and I had a lot of flack for this bit in my book, but the green lobby in Europe and its ability to form governments and control energy ministries has a lot of responsibility for the fact that we've made so little progress on climate change. And a really crucial thing to bear in mind is core to the green lobby in Europe is an anti-nuclear position. If you're anti-nuclear and you believe in decentralised societies, then wind and rooftop solar are overwhelmingly attractive technologies. By the way, this isn't a criticism of what I regard as an ideology. It's simply a statement. That is an ideology. So when we had our 203 white paper with Messrs. Hewitt and Beckett, both ex-CND, the objective of squeezing the nuclear out of the programme was very, very crucial to the package, and that led to a policy for the UK in 203, probably the worst white paper we've seen in the energy sector, and there are many rivals, I assure you, of what I facetiously called a policy of addressing climate change through draft excluders and windmills. Now, it's a facetious comment. Of course, it's unfair, but I want to lay one more important point behind this. Not only is it the case that things like offshore wind and rooftop solar are phenomenally expensive, it's also true they couldn't solve the global warming problem. None of the existing current renewables are capable of decarbonising the world's economy. Why? Because they are low-density, intermittent energy sources. We might solve the intermittency, I'll come back to it, but not for some time. But you simply cannot find enough land and shallow water to cover in wind farms to make a significant difference to global warming. You similarly can't do it with current generation biomass and biocrops. And David Mackay, in his brilliant book, and if you haven't read it, I think it should be a compulsory textbook for anybody who wants to open their mouth and talk about climate change, demonstrates the arithmetic. And I quote in the book, and I've never quite worked out from David why he does it this way, but to replace about half the petrol in people's cars per day in the UK requires wind farms 4 kilometres deep around the entire coast of Britain, and I can't remember if he throws in half of Wales as well. And the point here is not to say you shouldn't do some wind. It's not to say you shouldn't deploy some offshore wind. It's to say the Renewables Directive directs you to spend all your money on those things. Okay? Now, what people then say is, oh, yeah, but you know, we do that, but we do some other things. The only source of money to pay for this is customers' bills. You know, do it through the tax system if you like, but it's what we are capable of paying for. And if you take all this money out of people to pay for very expensive solutions which do very little to the problem, you haven't got much left for other alternatives. So the real problem with the Renewables Directive is it skews you into this short-term, narrow set of technologies. Now, I'll mention the EU ETS in a second alongside this, but just to finish off this bit on these technologies. The argument which the energy bill has behind it, and many people make, is, oh, you don't understand. Look, these are immature technologies. And what we've got to do is spend a huge sum of money deploying them because the costs are going to come crashing down and then they're going to be mature, and we're told in the white paper, and then they're going to be subject to competitive tender. Now, just ask yourself a question, right? Even if these technologies mature, and certainly for onshore wind, I think the thing goes round and round and it has a stick, and you know, there's not sort of, you're not going to invent any new technology to go with this stuff, right? I mean, there's a limit to what you can do, right? Even if you do that, it can't answer the question. Right? It cannot make a significant contribution to decarbonising the globe. Okay? And offshore wind, there are some inherent difficulties. You know, it's at sea. It's salty. It's hard to maintain. It's not like one on land. You can't land a helicopter on the top. You can get really good with the logistics. You can take out 10 or 20 pound a megawatt hour, but you're never going to get to 50. Right? You'll be very lucky if you get to 100. It's more likely going to be 120. Okay? So you have to have the board. And biomass and biocrops, current generation, think about it. You want to turn power stations into log-burning stoves. You want to cut down trees, turn them into pellets, ship them across the Atlantic, unload them and stick them in a power station and burn them at the end and claim that that is going to help us solve global warming. We're doing it because the Renewables Directive lets you do it, not because it's a solution to global warming either. And that's very important. And half the Renewables Directive in Europe is being achieved by so-called biomass. And there aren't the fields to do this stuff. Now, that may sound all very negative, but I think it's very, very important to be coldly rational and realistic about the mess we're in. Because it's no point in just patting ourselves on the back and saying what wonderful people we are, and we're going to make this world leadership and make no difference. What the next generation will care about is the temperature, not whether we pretended we tried or not. So it's beholden then to think about what would you have to do if you wanted to address this question. Now I say if, because people say, when I tell you what I think we should do, people say, oh, it'll never happen. Well, that's probably right. So far we haven't done anything. There's not much evidence we're going to do anything going forward. But let me tell you what you'd have to do. The first thing is you have to have a price on carbon, carbon consumption. There's no point in pricing carbon production. You have to price carbon consumption. Otherwise, you just lead to substitution effects between carbon production and carbon consumption. That means you have to have a border carbon tax. The good news is there's a very small number of industries which are the bulk of carbon imports. We import things like cement, fertilizers, steel, etc. And any country that doesn't have a carbon price, like China effectively at the moment, is engaged in export subsidy. It's a distortion of trade not to have a carbon price. This isn't protectionism, this is making sure that everyone pays the proper price of externalities. And a separate paper I had with Cameron Hepburn, we explained how this creates a major incentive for the exporting country to have their own carbon price and address the question. It's a bottom-up rather than top-down. It's not Kyoto. I mean, just remember Kyoto. Okay. At Durban, the world's leaders gathered after the circus at Copenhagen, and they decided that what they would do is they would try by 2015 to work out what they might do after 2020. And Chris Huhne came to the House of Commons and told us that was a triumph. By that time, China and India would be twice their current size and have between 400 and 600 gigawatts of new coal on the world system. It's 3 coal stations a week at the moment. Okay? You need a lot of windmills to make up for 3 coal power stations a week. And these are unconstrained coal stations. I'll come on to Europe's coal record in a second. So we need a bottom-up approach. If you have a carbon consumption tax, you can do it unilaterally because you're not going to create a substitution out of your own industries. But that would be painful. And no politician is prepared to entertain that, as we see through the EU ETS, that everyone's really happy with a price of about 5. It's meaningless. Why bother? It's good news for all the traders who make lots of money out of it. It's good news for the incumbents who don't have to face the price of their pollution and also have entry barriers through the permits, but it does nothing whatsoever to climate change. You want a long-term, rising and stable carbon price. We have a short-term, volatile and low price. You couldn't make it up. Pointless in that frame, but the political commitment to it is enormous. We're all terribly proud in Europe of having the first major trading market. The litmus test in this comes, and you can read this one, okay? Why do the Australians want to join the EU ETS? Could it be that they think the price will be low and a lot lower than the carbon tax they were threatened with instead? I thought that was a good measure of where we're going on the EU ETS front. So we need a carbon price. The second thing, and this is where I get myself into serious difficulty with large numbers of people, particularly of a green persuasion. I count myself as very much an environmentalist, but not a green in the conventional sense, is I think that there is no hope virtually whatsoever on constraining the temperatures to 2-3 degrees, maybe 4, unless we can stop the dash for coal. Okay? Between now and 2020, the challenge is how to prevent the world system agglomerating at least 400 gigawatts, probably 600 gigawatts plus of coal onto the world system. If that happens, then you really are in the working your way up towards the 500s. Because the inevitable, it'll take time beyond 220 for that to happen, but the logjam is in the frame. So how do you stop the dash for coal? Well, step forward Satan. Sorry, he's called Bush. Step forward the Americans. Okay. The fastest falling emissions in the world, in the developed world, are in the United States. Not in Europe, not even carbon production in Europe. The great Satan, the great enemy of the green movement, America, is doing vastly more to address climate change at the moment than anyone in Europe is. How's it doing it? Switching from coal to gas. Coal's fallen from nearly 40% of its electricity generation to nearly 20%. Gas has half the emissions of coal. It's an enormous break on what otherwise would have been an expansion of coal in the United States. Now, this is done by terrible stuff called shale gas. I have to say it very quietly because you might get into trouble. Now, shale gas has serious environmental problems attached to it. Shale gas production causes methane leakages. If it's near a water table, will pollute the water with gas, add some more. It might cause earthquakes, and it uses a lot of water, and it uses some chemicals. So the reaction of the Europeans is ban it. Terrible stuff. Can't possibly let this happen. That's the French reaction. Couldn't have anything to do with the nuclear power stations, the German reaction, and so on. Now ask yourself the following question. if we don't build gas, what will we do instead? Now, I respect people who say we'll build windmills and solar panels instead, okay? But that's not what's happening in Europe. In Germany, we're going from nuclear to coal and from gas to coal. There are 24 new coal power stations being constructed in Europe now. Germany's just opened a 2.2 gigawatt lignite coal power station. Okay? You worry about lock-in, right? That's lock-in. We are locking in a lot of coal. Now let me, ladies and gentlemen, give you a little comparison between shale gas and coal. Okay? To lead you to the conclusion, anyone who bans shale gas, just automatically, should make it utterly illegal to dig any coal anywhere in the world. You open a coal mine, methane spews out. It's typically quite close to water tables. It pollutes the water table with heavy metals. It reduces the life expectancy of everyone who goes into the coal mine. Chinese coal mines kill 5,000 people a year. It uses an enormous amount of energy to get the coal out. It used to be the third largest consumer of electricity in Britain, the coal industry, when the steel industry was, I think, second. Then you've got to get the stuff out. You've got to transport it. You've got to stack it in heaps which are quite radioactive. Then you've got to put it through a power station. You use an enormous amount of water in a conventional coal power station. You've got the SOx, the NOx, you've got the ash, you've got the loss of thermal efficiency, etc. Need I go on? If you're going to ban shale gas, then make sure you ban all the fossil fuels, because the others are worse. That doesn't mean you shouldn't regulate it, but it means you do it. And lock-in's a problem. And gas is only a transition. It's a fossil fuel. But to be against gas in the current context, I would take a bet with anyone here. The consequence is you're committing yourself to more coal and more global warming. So that's why I think gas has a transitional role to play in heading off, in the short term, as the only deployable technology at scale, the dash for coal. And that is what we're doing in Europe. We're engaged in a dash for coal. We're exiting gas across Europe and getting into coal in virtually every European country. So my first step is you want a proper price of carbon for consumption, including border attachments. The second is burn the gas rather than the coal in transition. Of course, I accept the lock-in problem, and you have to deal with the lock-in problem, but that's not beyond the wit of man, a woman, and in any event, the alternative is to lock in a whole suite of new coal power stations. The third bit is, to me, the most optimistic bit, the one that's probably going to solve our climate change problem, and the one where it's relatively easy to do something about it. The energy industries and the electricity industries have been stuck with the same technological makeup for nearly 100 years. The coal station is 19th century. There are cables outside here which are 19th century oil-filled cables in London. The PWR and the gas turbine are Second World War technologies. Okay, so not quite a century for those. Okay? Nothing else has happened apart from adding computers to dispatching power stations and operationalising the system. Nothing else at all. Now, people assume that will go on. Well, if you buy my argument that current renewables cannot solve the climate change problem, and of course gas can't solve the climate change problem, then you either have to say that you're going to live with the climate change, full stop, or you have to have new technologies. There's no if or but about it. Now, the fantastically good news is after a century, the energy industries, the laboratories, the universities are absolutely awash with new ideas to generate electricity. There are really attractive near-market technologies like next-generation solar, artificial photosynthesis. There's a whole host of generation technologies. Remember, there are 4 ways of doing this if it's low carbon: solar, geothermal, gravity, and nuclear. They're the only 4 you've got. Gravity is hydro and tidal wave, and all things come from the moon's gravitational pull. That's it. There's a huge amount going on. And then behind that lies the application of IT to energy systems, Smart meters, smart grids, making the whole of the demand side active. Then there's storage, batteries. There's a transformational effect on the electricity industry of electrifying transport and getting out of oil, and so on. Now here's the punch. Instead of spending 100 billion on offshore wind and the related stuff to prove we can deploy it at such scale as to meet the renewables directive, a few billion for R&D would be a much better payoff. There are virtually no R&D programs in the world that cost more than $1 billion, except CERN. I read in the papers, one of the great things about an Oxford College is you're not surrounded by other economists, you're surrounded by people who do other sensible subjects. And I read in the papers about artificial photosynthesis at Birmingham University. So I said to my engineering colleague, how much would it cost to demonstrate this stuff? You know, would £1 million be a good research grant? Oh, actually, might need a bit more. 5 million? That's a lot. 10? I tell you what, 100 million, $1 billion, right? The payoff ratio between devoting ourselves to the new renewables and the new energy industries of the future, as opposed to devoting all our resources to deploying existing renewables, is a no-brainer. And that's where America is streets ahead of Europe. America has the gas instead of the coal, and it has the core technological base. That's where the Googles and the Microsofts come from. And the idea that we're going to rebuild our economy on green jobs in constructing wind farms off the Scottish coast, compared with the opportunities given our science base to actually address global warming, these are different pictures. I'm very optimistic we can get there and do that. Whether it stops it at 2 or 3 degrees, I have no clear idea. I think we're committed to quite a lot. Now let me bring that back to where we are here in conclusion. I've said that the real underlying causes of global warming are driven by coal, by China, by the exports side of that, the carbon consumption being our responsibility of it. I've said that the existing renewables policies cannot possibly solve the climate change problem. And I've said that there are much better ways of deploying our scarce resources in the short to medium term, as well as further into the future. Politicians, after 12 years, have forgotten that this is the question they're supposed to be answering. So Mr. Davey wrote a little speech. I presume someone wrote it for him. He certainly made the speech to the CBI. And he commended the EMR, the package, to us on the basis of its characteristics. And he said there were 5 myths out there about this package. I'm not going to make this up. Okay? His first myth is that it's too complicated. Can anyone think of a more complicated structure for energy policy than EMR? With individual negotiations for individual contracts, with the government involved. I have what I'm called the optician's test. There's some people here with glasses, and I apologise for those who've heard this one before. Okay? If you've got glasses, you need glasses, you go to the optician and they put the thing up on the wall. And you try and work out, can I remember what it was to catch the person out? This is the human psyche in an optician's is really quite funny. Or, you know, surely they put something wicked at the bottom, you know, to catch out. Okay? I have a slide which has all the current interventions I can work out that we've got in the energy market. And I put it up and I put to you that it's worse than the bottom line. You can't read any of it. There are so many interventions. I defy any member of the civil service to name the majority of the current interventions in the market. And the gas strategy added off shale and various other things as well. And now the capacity market is supposed to drive the gas side. Complicated? It's phenomenally complicated. The second myth is, apparently it's a myth that it's too statist. Well, it's a central buyer model. We have the government deciding which technologies we're going to have. Great. No wonder lobbying is such a profitable activity in the United Kingdom. The idea that ministers and governments will pick the right technologies. We know what they're going to pick. Offshore wind in preference to onshore wind because people don't like onshore wind and offshore wind's offshore and out of sight and even more expensive. If you write down the list of things that you know they're going to pick, this is not a market-driven alternative. The third one, he says, is it's a myth that it's a nuclear subsidy. Really? Of course it's a nuclear subsidy. If nuclear is going to need a fit of 100 and the current price is 50, it's a subsidy. Actually, it's a subsidy that isn't a subsidy, but it's only a subsidy the same as the subsidy that the other renewables are getting, but they're all getting differential subsidies. You work that out. The fourth one is that it's going to encourage competition. He says it's a myth to say it's not going to encourage competition. It's going to cause, in Davy's own words, a blitz of competition. Really? The government negotiating these contracts, ensuing auctions for some time into the future until new competition comes along. That isn't a recipe for competition. And the fifth one, which is what I want to close on, he says it's a myth there are better, cheaper ways of securing investment, cutting climate change, and cutting carbon emissions, keeping the lights on. Ladies and gentlemen, there are better, this is why I wrote this down, cheaper and more secure ways of doing this. If you want to reduce carbon and you want to achieve a given quantity investment, you fix the Q and you fix the carbon, and you auction long-term capacity contracts sufficient to meet your capacity requirement, and you then label those auctions on your carbon trajectory. Two interventions, one to fix the quantity, the other to fix the carbon position, and then you auction it. That's pro-competition, that's pro-market, and that will reveal just how many subsidies different technologies are sitting on, which we don't need to pay for, and which are not helping to contribute to addressing climate change. Climate change is the most serious of the problems we confront. It's one for which we've made no progress whatsoever, and there's no evidence whatsoever that if the government's asked to explain how EMR, the bill, is going to reduce the chances of global warming, that they have anything positive to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dieter. I suspect there may be a few questions. Can I just ask that you identify yourself and that you keep your questions as brief as possible, because I'm going to try and get around as much as possible. This chap in the far end here. Put his hand up first.
Hi, Sean Williams, Friends of the Earth. Just wanted to know whether the Professor thought that shale gas would be viable without the tax breaks that the Chancellor's proposed.
The answer to that is it depends from location to location. Some shale gas won't pass the test. I think when we get to the question of taxing it, when you say tax breaks, okay, there are two parts to this. We tax all, or almost all, fossil fuels we extract except coal. Okay, so the dirtiest one is untaxed. Okay? Then there's the question about whether you can offset the investment against profits going forward. Okay? I'm not clear what this tax break is that's going forward there, but I would want to add one more thing here. People say, you know, the argument about burning gas in Britain depends upon shale gas in Britain. Not a bit of it. It doesn't matter if Europe produces no shale gas to what's happened in the world energy markets. You know, we've moved from a world in which we were going to have peak oil and peak gas, gas was a scarce resource, to one of superabundance. And as I make clear in the book, the problem isn't that we're going to be rescued by running out of oil and gas. It's much more serious than that. We've got more fossil fuel than we needed to fry this planet several times over. And on the gas side, from policy point of view, globally, you should assume the supply is pretty close to infinite. And you just got to look at even conventional gas to see the scale of the discoveries piling in. Now, what that means is the United States has exited the LNG market. It's true that gas prices haven't fallen very much, but then 50-something nuclear reactors came off in Japan in one go, and the world's gas markets absorbed that. Okay? So my view about this is there's no shortage of gas. It's independent of what arrangements the British government put in place. British shale gas won't make any difference to 220 to this equation. But gas prices in Europe will be affected. Remember, we've got enormous shale gas sitting on the edge of Europe. Algeria is probably bigger than America. This stuff is everywhere. The reason is because shale is everywhere. Okay? And that's why for an environmental group, the crucial thing is to address this question. I'll put it to you. Okay? If you don't want the gas, and this is the thing that everyone now on the green side demonstrates against, fine. But you've got to stop the coal as well and confront people with the consequence of doing that. And right across Europe at the moment, the consequence of the action of many Greens to limit government's room for manoeuvre on gas has been to result in more pollution from coal power stations. And that's why I think the game's moved on. And those people who care about climate change, and I include all the Greens within this framework, have to find a way through this wall of coal. And I don't think it's good enough to say we shouldn't burn the gas and then allow this coal to go on. How could we build 2.2 gigawatts of lignite in one power station in Germany? How could this be allowed to happen? That's why I get angry about that point. But the tax thing, I'm not quite sure what he's done. But remember, all fossil fuels are taxed except coal.
Yeah, we'll go to the one front and then we'll go to one at the back. Just this.
Peter Barnes from Cleveland Associates. Just a question about the politics. We've gone from the Conservatives having a vote blue, go green policy towards George Osborne saying that climate change is not important and we should focus on growth and getting out of the recession. Do you think it is politically feasible for a government to impose costs which are potentially detrimental towards economic growth at a time of recession in order to promote responsible climate change policies?
Well, I'm not in supporting any particular political party's objectives, but let me strip out some things here. First of all, the most remarkable thing about the energy bill is that energy-intensive producers are going to be exempt, right? It's quite remarkable. That's where most of our pollution is, right? And so we design a system which we know is going to be damaging, so let's exclude them all. Okay? And by the way, just an aside, when people say, or Mr. Davies says it's not complicated, okay? I ask the question, is the exemption from the FITs the same as the exemptions from the other climate change measures we've got for large industrial users? And I was told that every single exemption we've got is different from the others. And they all have different levels of different groups being exempted to different degrees. It's fantastically complicated. Carbon tax is simple. You don't have to worry about such things. It's just clean. Okay? So it's all on consumers. Now, I tell you what really worries me and has always worried me about the current renewables strategy. I mean, and as I say, my position isn't anti-renewables. It isn't anti-doing some wind. It isn't anti some offshore wind. It's anti-putting all the eggs in this particular basket. I have two laws of energy policy. The first one is, Helm's first law is, customers must be able to pay. And the second Helm's law of energy policy is, if customers can pay, they must be willing to vote for politicians who are going to force them to pay. By 2015, 10% of all households in this country will be spending, 25%, 1/4 of all households in this country will be spending at least 10% of their disposable income on their household energy supplies. Now, it's nice and warm in here, but I bet you there are some people tonight who actually are a bit worried about putting some money in the meter, even though they're extremely cold. And if you project forward these costs, you get to a world where they probably can't pay. And then they're not going to pay. And I think that issue is important. Now, remember where Mr. Huhn and others were. They believe the following. I extrapolate from what they said, but this is part of the logic. We knew in 2010, at least Mr. Huhn did, because I was in the room with him when he agreed to this, that the oil price is going to double. The gas price is going to remain linked to the oil price. Shale gas is never going to happen here, and what happens in America is never going to have any impact on us. Therefore, and this is my extrapolation, not only is it the case that all the renewables are going to be economic, even the offshore wind. If you double the oil price and make it 200, even offshore wind gets under that wicket, okay? Or roughly. There's some offshore wind that might not, okay? All these renewables are going to be economic. And you know, those poor sods in America, their economy is going to be crippled. They're going to be landed with all this really expensive oil and gas. Their energy-intensive industries are going to be piling into South Wales and to other parts of Britain because this is the cheap energy source, because wind and solar is the way to power your energy industry of the future. Now, that is how you get into this logic. And remember, the current Secretary of State thinks that domestic users are going to be spending 8% less their aggregate bill in 2020 than they are today. Why? And I deal with this in my book. For the complete nonsense that the idea that A, we're actually going to achieve all the Green Deal and do the energy efficiency, that may or may not happen. I doubt it very much because it's a terribly badly designed program. But even if it was, if you increase energy efficiency, you lower the price of energy, the effective price. If any of you come to my first-year economics tutorials and you tell me that when the price of something falls, demand falls, I will ask you to give me some deep explanation of what's happened to the laws of economics. Okay? And for 200 years, Jevons law has applied that an increase in energy efficiency leads to an increase in the aggregate demand for energy. And that's all that matters for climate change. So don't believe it for a moment that we're going to get to 220 with lower bills. The way in which energy efficiency will be combined with the energy demand reduction is because the demand reduction will be driven because the price of energy is so high that people reduce their demand. It just doesn't add up. So the politics of this, in the sense of I'm concerned about them, are how do you carry the general public who are reluctant to spend very much in a recession on environmental issues to do something constructive about climate change? If I tell you burn gas instead of coal in the short run, I think that's doable. If I say, tell you what, we'll close the coal stations and we won't build any gas stations, we'll just do offshore wind and a bit of onshore wind and some solar panels, I don't believe the public, when they realise what that costs, are going to vote for it. And then, for me, it's a tragedy because I care about climate change.
Do you think any of the three parties are really grappling with that issue about costs towards 2020? Because that's when we're talking about the...
No. I mean, the thing about 2020 was it's far enough away to be beyond 2 general elections when these people committed to it, okay? It's easy to do so. And remember the dynamics of this, which I deal with in the book, and this is a political point. In the last 25 years in Europe, the votes, because I asked myself, how the hell did the Europeans sign up to this stuff? Like, how did they do it, right? If you look at the last 25 years, you'll find the votes for the 2 major parties in most European states has been in decline. Certainly true here. The result is that coalition, it was pretty normal anyway in Europe, but now is ubiquitous. But what did happen was the Greens replaced the Liberal parties across Europe as the coalition party of choice in a number of countries. Ireland, Germany in particular, and here you can think the Lib Dems have some of those characteristics. They always demanded the energy ministry, and then they always went for these particular technologies. That's changing. The pirates are scoring more than the German Greens. And the cathartic change in Europe will come if the Greens are not part of the coalition after 2013, ahead of the European elections in 2014, when the Commission changes. And I think actually the big chance is there to change European energy and climate change policy for the good. But it's that bit of politics that's there. And I think that's, in some sense, I think it's very sad that's passing because, you know, many of these parties are deeply committed to sustainability and all the things that go with it. But, you know, the road to hell can be paved with many good intentions. And it's not enough to have good intentions. They have to deliver the outcome, and they haven't.
Okay. Jonathan at the back there.
Hi there. Jonathan Lee Kum, the environment editor from the Sunday Times. And I went to a select committee hearing last week, and John Hayes was speaking with one of his civil servants. And after they got a bit, after the MPs got a bit glazed eyes over the complexity of what they were hearing, one of them asked, did DEC ever model the idea of recreating an entity like the CGB to oversee renewable technologies or low carbon technologies, and especially nuclear? And apparently they did model it. They looked at the idea and may rejected it, I think for what came across as mainly political reasons. But I wonder what you thought of the idea of recreating something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So you might be surprised at this answer, but listen to it all as opposed to quote, sort of take out bits of it, okay? Okay. I think there are two...
Jonathan never does anything
No,
that.
I certainly didn't mean it in Jonathan's thing, but if you've had the press coverage I've had in The Guardian, you'll be very careful to make sure these things are there. I am the gas maniac and all sorts of other things. So that's why I said, but no disrespect, Jonathan, at all. Indeed, quite the contrary, I have the highest respect. So there are two ways of going about this EMR. One is to go down the market route. And that's a market route with intervention. So I have always argued that the FITs and the capacity market ought to be merged into a single long-term capacity auction. And it's a two-stage auction. The second stage checks to see you're on the right carbon trajectory. I'd rather not do that. I'd rather just have a carbon price varying to whatever level is necessary to achieve that. But basically, I want everyone to be able to bid into this and get contracts. This is pro-competition, especially brings in new entrants, and especially the demand side and storage into the equation, okay? And it reveals the cost. That's a market-orientated way. So I can simplify EMR, achieve the outcomes of it with a single auctioned model, still fixing the level of capacity, the quantity, but not the price, and following the carbon trajectory. That's model one. Model two is the state really wants to be a central buyer. And that's effectively what it does in EMR. It's a central buyer. It wants to decide what contracts are set. Now, in the way it's constructed in the bill, that is a fantastically expensive way of doing things because you've got to contract with the private sector with all the uncertainties that everyone's discussing about this. Remember, the energy bill is just a shell. It doesn't tell you what the fits are going to be. You know, do you know what the control levy is going to be? How it's going to affect particular bids? Should you get your project in now? Should you get in later? Will they change the rules later? Okay, it's a very high cost of capital world. Okay, and my view is the following, and this is why I'm very careful about how I'm quoted. If the state was to nationalise the industry and do the planning as the CEGB did it, it would take out all those costs of the cost of capital of uncertainty because all the political and regulatory risk would now be in the hands of the state. It would have all the problems of the CEGB, and I'm not in favour of it. That's the point I want to be clear. But I have to say, I think a CEGB model is actually preferable to what we've constructed. Now, to be fair to Mr. Davey, he would say, oh, no, you don't understand. We're on a four-part path to an auction model that I support. For very quite complicated reasons, I don't believe for a moment that we're going to migrate from this model towards an auction model as the technologies mature. Okay? And some of those reasons are the bodies that are going to be buried in the contracts that are set originally, the lobby groups, the interested parties, and a whole political economy of how that works. The simplest way I can express it is they are really pregnant with intervention. And the trouble with being pregnant is it's quite hard not to be pregnant, and the more you're pregnant, the harder that is. This is a process, and at each step, I'm trying to make the analogy work, as you can see.
There's a lot of men in this audience, no idea what you're talking about.
But my point is that this is it's not an infection, it's like a way of being caught with something. And the reaction at each step is to invent two more things. Okay? So the gas strategy never figured till a year ago. Okay? But we fixed the renewables. Then we decided to fix every individual renewable because some were making more money than others, so we banded them all. We're fixing the nuclear. We fixed the coal with the EPS. Okay? Oh, what are we going to do about gas? Oh, we better fix that too. Oh, and then we better have an off-shale. Right? And if you look at utility regulation, every peer review introduces two more mechanisms. Nobody has ever simplified utility regulation. And the analogy carries across here. This will get more and more complicated. And so actually, I think a state-directed, state-owned, you let the contracts, of course, is better than what we've got. But both are massively inferior to just auctioning the damn contracts. Let's find out if offshore wind can really compete against nuclear power. Let's make the nuclear power bid a price. Let's see. And then if a politician says, well, the offshore wind has bid 150 and the current price is 50, but we're going to do the offshore wind. This is to build on the Keynesian analysis. This is shining the torch. You, the politician, can't do that
without it being absolutely clear that you did it in the clear knowledge you were paying a premium of 100 to do this. Fine to do it, but let's have it out in the open. That's what auctions do. And that is why every main incumbent and all the politicians that I've come across and every lobby interest is against my auctioning proposition. Right? I'm heartened by that. Right? But that's my answer. It's the right question to ask. It would be better than what we've got.
Dieter, just on your preferred model, get beyond the complexities of auctioning, which I hope you recognise as considerable. There's still somebody in government setting that quantity. Mm-hmm. And that obviously doesn't have the risk that you've got many of the characteristics of the CEGB, i.e. that we're oversupplied with energy in that example, because governments will always add extra capacity.
Yeah, okay, so the first point is, wouldn't it be a luxury to have excess capacity? Okay, the asymmetry of excess capacity versus deficient capacity is, to me, blindingly obvious. Now, it's true, the CEGB did build too many power stations, although not quite for the reasons that people imagine. You see, in the 1970s, when most of our coal stations and nukes and stuff were built, it was a rule of thumb, which was applied in virtually every industrialised country, that 3% economic growth meant 7% increase in electricity demand. Okay? So I have a paper, a CGB paper written in 1970 called The Electricity Industry, the Next 25 Years. And it's a really high-quality bit of forecasting. And it tells you need nearly 100 gigawatts of power in 1995, and we need about 50. Okay? Why? Because it turned out that energy demand, electricity demand, did not grow with growth. We didn't have much growth, actually, but it didn't grow with growth. And peak to peak and trough to trough in the Thatcher years is 1.7, so it's much lower than the 3. Okay? But actually, we were outsourcing and deindustrialising as we had the exchange rate adjustment and became a petrocurrency. So it's not quite true that they did. And the other thing was they were always capital constrained. It's a very odd thing. And one of the reasons we privatised stuff was because the Treasury wouldn't be forthcoming with the money. Okay? But the more substantive question is, you cannot deliver a security of supply margin, an excess supply margin, in an electricity system by leaving it to itself. The market will never deliver that 10, 15 or 20% surplus. Why? Because no rational capitalist will ever engineer a market where supply is above the mean. And in the electricity industry, it drives the marginal cost below the average cost and leads to losses across the pitch. That's also why the gas industry oppose strategic storage. Okay? Now, why do we want that? It's called insurance. It's the insurance in the absence of storage that if there's a demand shock, the lights will stay on at a reasonable price. Okay? Now, what a capacity market is, and by the way, I can't see how what the gas strategy recommends leads to a capacity market as opposed to capacity contracts, all of different durations, but that's an aside. Okay? What a capacity market does is develop that market. Now, who decides what the excess capacity will be? It's a system property, not an individual decision property. So the aggregate of individual decisions will never equal the system optimum. Now, so we'll never get it right. And anyway, planning 5 years ahead, who knows what growth and et cetera is going to be. So my answer to this question is, the question is, how do we get this? The answer is 20. Okay? If you'd like 15, that's fine. But in 2016, when you try out 4, you'll think that 20 would be a luxury. Right? And any real recovery of economic growth, then we will be in a serious constraint by 2016, 2017. Because everything that's on there at the moment assumes that the kit works. And a lot of it's very old. Okay? If we don't have any economic growth, well then, like now, we'll have a capacity margin that's fine. You'll never get it right, but 20 is roughly right. 5 is almost precisely wrong. And that's it.
Okay, well, I saw a few heads shaking on that, but we'll move on. Take a question from Dustin, and then this chap down here, and then we'll come to this side next. Take 2 at this stage, yeah? Dustin.
Hi, Dustin Benton from Green Alliance. If I can caricature the argument that's been made, and I apologise for squishing it down to 2 glib quotes. The first point is get serious, and the second point is get rid of coal by getting out of gas.
Getting into gas, not out of gas.
Sorry, getting into gas, forgive me. So let's just think about the UK. Arguably, at least the UK has serious laws, even if not all of our politicians are serious. And the UK has also effectively banned coal. So my question is, what should we do? Should we still go into gas, or should we do something else?
Okay, hold that thought. So should we still go to gas? And then the chap in the third row here.
It's Robert Cohen from Berco. I just want to make the observation that the US coal is still being burnt, even if not onshore, it's been exported and burnt elsewhere. And the other point is what price carbon to actually achieve 3 degrees or 4 degrees or whatever, and what chance that price is going to ever, or when that price will actually be imposed around the world.
Okay.
When the subsidies are at $500 billion.
Yeah, I think you should, just aside, people all keep quoting this $500 billion, and they mix up the difference between some very highly taxed fossil fuels and some very under-taxed fossil fuels, and countries like Germany that subsidise coal. And so if you look at petrol prices in Britain, there's a huge amount of tax in there. There's not in coal. So I think the $500 billion is just an aside. It's not a, it's just say, people keep banning it. It's just an aggregate number that's meaningless. The really interesting is the components. Okay. So let me take both these. Yeah, get serious. Okay. And what I mean by get serious is not get serious, let's all get concerned. I mean, do something that actually can do something about global warming. Right? That's what I mean by get serious. Okay. Don't pretend you're doing something by building large numbers of offshore wind farms, for example. Now, get out of coal into gas, okay? You're absolutely right. We are going to close some of our coal stations, okay? So the question is, what are we going to replace them with, okay? We can either encourage a process of doing it or do it by fear. And I think it's a good thing we're going to get out of coal, but just remember, not that many. I genuinely think there might be such a serious situation in 215, 216 that we get a derogation of the Large Combustion Plant Directive if we're not at that stage anyway negotiating exit from the EU. Remember, a lot of this stuff may not apply. I mean, half East German is to me horrifying, but this may not, you have to think about that frame. If we're really in serious shortage, do you think you'll sit there and look at a coal station that could work and tell people, sorry, I know you're coal, but, and it's very expensive, but no chance. Then there's the refurbishment of the existing coal stations. This is very dangerous. Remember, the Large Combustion Plant Directive is not about carbon, right? It's about SOx and NOx, okay? And similarly with the IED. And that's how Germany can build new coal stations, lignite stations, with an expectation of a long life for those stations, okay? So the question is, what's to be put in its place? And that really is the question here. And the question that's in the gas strategy is, do you want to put some gas power stations in there? Or do you want to not put any gas stations in there and close the coal stations and say, oh my goodness, what will happen? Now, what I really fear in that circumstance is more coal will be burnt. Now, I didn't at any point say that we should build 26 gigawatts of gas. You commit a crime in this country, a politically incorrect crime, by even suggesting you should build one gas station, right? There's no question we need to build some. How many we build is a really open question, and that's partly a question of what do you do instead. That's the counterfactual. On the price of the US coal, you're absolutely right about US coal. Okay, so they're exporting the stuff. Okay, that's another reason why coal is so cheap in Europe. And indeed, that leads to the idea that we should compulsorily close the coal stations rather than just leaving it to some market signal to get there. Okay. Now, we know that to make a difference, the carbon price to the coal-gas substitution, which is all it can do in the period to 220, right? I mean, it's very limited possibilities, okay? You need a price that looks like 60 plus, right? Okay? And if you really want to limit global emissions, you need a price at that level or higher, okay? Are we going to prepared to pay that price? Remember what I said. It was, if we want to address climate change, then this is what we have to do. Okay? Now here I'm on board with, and I think if I've been critical of certain aspects of green lobbies, I'm on board. Ultimately, we can blame the politicians for not doing this, but we elect the politician. And the question is ultimately in ourselves, we human beings, are we prepared to vote for people who are going to impose those costs upon us? If you ask me as a betting man, the answer is no. Did we ought to? I'm with you, right? I think we should, and I think one should argue for that, but then I'm not quite dead academic scribbler in the background of that. That's probably not going to help you out of the argument, but my point is, the right answer is, you're not talking at €5 a tonne, okay, or 1.5 to 2 in the CERs. You're not talking at 30. You're talking significantly north of that. And remember, I want it to be on consumption and not production.
Okay, I'll take the 2 questions here in the 3rd row.
Clive Bates. Dieter, I've read your book, highly recommend it. It's a model of clarity. But one thing I felt was that it had a bit of an element of don't start from here. You know, we've got the Renewables Directive, it is law. We've got the ETS, it's a lot of vested interests in it. We've got the Climate Change Act, which is a unilateral commitment. If you were advising the Secretary of State on what to actually do, facing the circumstances he's in at the moment, what would you actually do with the things that we're already committed to?
Well,
okay, hold that thought, and then Peter, and then we'll take the lady by the door there.
Yeah, Peter Young, Aldersgate Group. Quite a lot of depressing stuff here. I think one of the bits you said, which I believe in, which is on the optimistic side, is the fantastic new technologies, second-generation technologies that are coming out. You mentioned about the need to actually put more money into that, which I'd agree with. But the only thing I can think of where the government's actually set aside £1 billion RD&D programme is carbon capture and storage. And the last government did that, and we've achieved absolutely nothing with that so far. So I'd be interested to know 2 things. One, whether you see carbon capture and storage has a role going forward, and if so, when? And secondly, do you think we need some new institution, even if we were to get the political agreement to spend on RD&D, in order to actually deliver it? Because I've yet to meet anyone in DEC who looks competent to do so.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question by the door, briefly, if you will. Sorry, I know there's more hands popping up.
Leonie Green, Renewable Energy Association. I'm surprised, actually, at how much I agree with what you said today, but I feel that you have a tendency to greatly underestimate the cost of gas. So, for example, over £200 has been added to people's bills, very largely because of the increase in the price of gas. Now, that is way more than we need to deliver, nothing less than a renewables revolution, actually. So the cost of meeting the 2020 targets to 2030 is actually relatively modest. So I feel that you underestimate the cost of gas. And I feel at the same time you overestimate the cost of renewables and don't talk about learning curves. And I think it's unfair for you to suggest that offshore wind, for example, should go into an auction against very mature technologies, which, as Charles Henry has said, fossil fuels and nuclear have received vast sums of subsidy historically. So actually, some renewables have phenomenal learning curves, like solar. I was pleased to hear you mention deep geothermal. It's technology the government have sidelined, but brilliant.
Sorry, we're running out of time.
So can you just respond to my perception that you're underestimating the cost of...
Okay, so future cost of gas, CCS, and what would you do if you're Ed Davey?
The answer is, I don't know what the cost of gas is going to be. In my auction system, these things get sorted. What I want to do is to make sure that coal pays the true cost of its pollution relative to gas, and that would lead to a substitution between those two. But it might go up and it might go down. Mr. Hune and Mr. Davey are convinced it's going to go up, and they're also convinced that somehow volatility is a problem. I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer. But if you ever suggest anything else than it's going up, okay, but if it is going up, then it's very good news for current renewables. You'll be more economic. And indeed, you could be, if the gas price doubles, which is what Mr. Hume thought, you could be economic without any subsidy at all. You'll win every auction that's there. And then you say, yes, but we don't really want to auction. The gas price is going to go up, so we're going to become more competitive. But please, God, don't give us an auction. Why? Because we're immature technology. Right? Now, I understand that point. Okay? That's why we want an R&D policy. But what gets conflated here is the idea that we should spend a very large sum of money on a very large deployment as an R&D policy. The gap between what you think the gas price is going to be and the cost of your offshore wind is the cost of the R&D deployment innovation policy. And the trouble is there are other options we could spend that money on, and I'm very in favour of spending a little bit of it, not all of it, just a little bit of it, on next generation renewables, which I'm very enthusiastic about. Okay? So that's where I come to on that. On the, I wouldn't start from here, the answer to that question is, in this book, I tried to be just brutally realistic. You cannot make progress on climate change unless you understand why we haven't, having tried all these things, made any progress. So I think the demolition job, if you like to put it in those terms, is absolutely essential. So we clear the crap, work out how serious we are, serious to put them going forward. And so what would I do? Well, day one, on the plane to Brussels, around every capital in Europe, can we do something about the Renewables Directive? Can we make it more flexible? Day two, round Europe, is it sensible to spend 50% of that on biomass, in much of it in an unsustainable way? Day three, keep going round Europe. Okay? The British government has never tried to negotiate in Europe for a more flexible programme. They've taken it as given and ramped it into the targets. Okay? Day three, I would seriously do something about CCS. Right? 1 billion. 100 billion out here, 1 billion. Now we have the shallow waters in the North Sea with known gas fields that are depleted with pipes to them and coal stations nearby. If it doesn't work in the North Sea, it won't work anywhere. That is about global warming. That's about deploying near technology. 1 billion, 99 billion left. Okay? And so I go on. Was there anything else I missed? Oh, no. No, what I've done with EMR, what I do with EMR is merge fits and, I mean, I'm very pragmatic too, believe it or not. I mean, I think you understand what its weaknesses are. You merge the fits and the capacity market into a single long-term capacity auction. I've written about this continuously. I actually think it's even possible to do it under the bill. Right? And you're nearly there, because what are the capacity contracts for gas now? They're fits. Okay? The only difference between the gas and the renewables is the renewables have to deliver the electricity, and the irony is the gas doesn't. It just has to be capable of delivering the electricity. This is ridiculous. Right? Now, in my auction world, it's firm auctions. So if you've got an intermediate technology, you have to sign secondary contracts with someone else to provide the backup. After all, the system has to. This would bring the costs of renewables, current renewables, into this framework as really uneconomic in the auctions. Okay? It's just a fact of the nature of their technology. Okay? And they'd have to bid that into the frame. And there'd be a secondary market in which you could buy that stuff, etc. But perfectly doable in EMR. Simplify it. Anything that's complicated in energy policy will almost certainly fail. Helm's Law 3. I've just invented it.
Okay. I'm really sorry. I know there are more questions. We're going to have to stop there. We've already overrun. Dieter's solving energy policy in 3 days. That's all it takes, apparently. But I would just thank you all for your wonderful questions and thank Dieter for a fantastic presentation. Thank you.